Good afternoon and welcome to our special council meeting for Monday, December 5th, 2022. This is our fourth budget meeting of a total of 4 meetings that we've had over the previous month. So I'll call the meeting to order at 4:01 p.m. First item on the agenda, 1.1, Land Acknowledgement. The town of Coaldale acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot peoples of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot peoples past, present, and future while recognizing their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The town of Coaldale is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Agenda item 1.2, Conflict of Interest Declaration, Pecuniary and Non-pecuniary. Are there any in the room this afternoon? None declared, thank you. Acceptance of the agenda. Is there any additions to this agenda this afternoon? Seeing none, could I get someone to make a motion to adopt the special council meeting agenda for December 5th, 2022? Deputy Mayor Pickering, all those in favor? Carried unanimously, thank you. Moving on to agenda item 4.1, budget deliberations, meeting 4 of 4. We have our Chief Financial Officer and Deputy CAO, Kyle Beauchamp, presenting. Kyle, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks and good evening, Council. So yes, we have the 4th budget deliberation meeting here for you. Table of contents agenda for this part. First, we're going to go over some financial information related to budget discussions, and then go further into the draft capital and operating budget from some of the items discussed at last week's meeting. So we've had some difficult discussions regarding taxes, funding levels required. It's never an easy conversation to have. So the purpose of this is to provide council with just some historical background on Coaldale's tax rates and some financial information over the past couple of years. So just again, this is a graphic that I use often in some of my presentations, so you've seen it in the past and you'll probably see it going forward. But it's important to remember that there's a quality of life that as town council has a desire for the community. Residents and businesses have a desire as they live and move into this community. The quality of service is often set by municipal services that we're able to provide, which are funded ultimately through various revenue streams. So go back, I'm going to go back 4 years here, just provide some details on the past. So municipal taxes, again, just so council has some historical background information when they're looking at tax increases or changes here. So in 2019, this was the start of the $128 recreational tax levy added to each developed residential parcel in Coaldale. When this was added, town council at the time to kind of offset some of the burden, approved the 0% tax increase for the residential tax base for 2019 and 2020. In 2020, we were beginning in the COVID-19 measures, so council also pushed this as a 0% tax increase over to the business community for the same year. As we were still in the COVID-19 crisis in 2021, council again approved a 0% tax increase through residential and non-residential. Part of this was done through a 2% reduction, elimination of cost of living for non-union staff. In 2022, so this past May, Town Council approved the mill rate bylaw, which saw a 0.56% increase in residential tax and a 4.16% increase in non-residential tax. So to kind of summarize, we have a table below here. It shows you that the average tax increase for a resident in Coaldale, excluding the $120 recreational levy, was 0.14% over the past 4 years. Again, this is an average because when we deal with inflation on property values, we can only deal with averages throughout the community. We can't deal with them on an individual basis. So one resident may be higher, one resident may be lower, but again, this is due to the law of averages with property valuation. On the non-residential tax base, you can see the average is 2.04% over 4 years. Both these numbers are lower compared to the annual inflation Canada has seen at an average of 3.21% over the years. So as inflation and costs of prices get higher throughout our country, Council has been able to keep our tax increases lower than that of inflation. We're looking at franchise fees and utilities. Past year, 2022, was the first year franchise fees have been touched in a number of years. Natural gas was 13% and electricity was 11% a number of years before this. Again, they went up 2% the past year. Utilities as well. There was a 3% increase January 1, 2019. But again, no utility rate has been changed since then, with the exception of the sewer flat charge of an increase of $6.97 per month this last January. That increase was solely related to the $12 million capital investment at the sewage treatment station. Again, so it's easy to balance a budget if you reduce municipal funding for future years as well. Future years, we're talking about reserves. But we're able to keep the tax increase minimal before, while increasing the amounts we're putting into reserves. So in 2019, we were about $1.6 million. As part of this budget, we'll be almost at $2 million over those years. So this is a good sign for Polio's future and future financial health, as we've been able to increase these funding for future capital projects, which is needed when we're seeing the cost of construction definitely increase over the past number of years. Just wanted to highlight some comparable information that you should be, that Count Mills has presented to the council before. So these two columns here show Coaldale's operating expenses compared to other municipalities. This is for 2020, so $14.586 million. These are operational expenses. On a per capita base, you'll see this is the lowest of all the comparables. These municipalities that we compared to a similar, that we've judged ourselves and compared to in other instances. Wages and benefits as well. You'll see that Coaldale's $5.5 million in 2020. Again, average per resident was $618, which was the lowest of the group. So just kind of summarize this information. Residential tax increase over the past 4 years, 0.14% compared to inflation of 3.12%. We've been able to do this as over the past 4 years. Town staff has worked diligently to control expenses while maintaining service levels as requested by council. 2019 to 2021, there was a lot of work done internally by reviewing internal contracts or existing contracts, where we're spending money, where can we save funds, and ultimately reinvest those funds back in the community, as you've seen through increases to our municipal reserves. Again, the data shows that the town's per capita operational expense and staff salaries are far below our municipal competitors. Saying that Coaldale staff are getting more done with less resources than others. And over the past 4 years, we haven't been able to rely on our reserves to balance our operational budget as well. Again, so the budget process is an estimate. We use statistical data and future forecasts to produce a realistic budget that we think is fairly close to what Coaldale's needs will be for the next year. Sometimes we do have operational budget surpluses, which these funds are again invested further back into capital projects that ultimately do have to be funded one way or another. We are expected to have an operating budget surplus of $150,000 for this year. But based on a $20 million operational budget, I just wanted to point out the margin of deviation is less than 1% on this. Okay, so going forth here, I'm just going to summarize kind of the discussions that we had from council on changes requested from our last budget meetings. So when we looked at the road rehabilitation program, originally we proposed $900,000 through the land sale reserve account and $100,000 through tax support. Town council wanted us to come back with some means to fund this without using tax support for 2023. We did have those additional grants that came to light a week ago. So what we did was we moved some funding around and took $100,000 from excess MSI that could fund that road rehabilitation program for 2023. Just a note being though that with this being funded through grants, any future funding for this program or a continuation of this program or an increase in this program would likely have to be funded through tax support. So for 2024, the base amount for this funding will be zero. So this will have to be another item revisited next year as well.
So Kyle, before you continue on, is there any questions for Kyle regarding this $100,000 that we're going to take it from the MSI for this year? Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
The next being the outdoor space. So nothing changed here, but we did move some funding around for some projects. The outdoor space previously was funded fully through grants. When we had to change some of the grant allocation, we reduced the amount reliance on grants, and we took some of the expected operating surplus to fund this. The reason this was done is just kind of the best practices too. Often there's some smaller charges that a grant will not accept or they will not be eligible under. So by reducing all the reliance from grants, if we have some charges that are not eligible in the grant, we're still covered that way as well. And then the bathroom and concession stand that council discussed before. So previously this was not in our budget. But again, with the access grants, what we did was allocate the majority of that, the LGFF. So this is the program again that's replacing MSI. So just again, LGFF is the Local Government Fiscal Framework Act. So with the outdoor skating rink plan to 2023, we're recommending that this be budgeted for 2024 based on current available funding at the moment. When we get further into the design and procurement of the project, if there's ability to create efficiencies or save costs, we recommend coming back and reevaluating this again to see if there is the potential that we could push this project up a year if it does make sense. But right now we just don't have as much information as we'd like to be firm on that recommendation to council. So our recommendation would be to propose for 2024 making utility tie-ins, rough-ins, and then reevaluate later next year if we can push this project up. This is just talking about the roundabouts, kind of at that Land Lakes Drive, McDonald's to Morton's intersection there. Previously was in the budget for single lane at $850,000. This is just a bump up to $900,000 based on council's direction to have this, I think, double lane roundabout. So we talked a lot about grants and what we have available. So instead of giving you a big Excel spreadsheet to be confusing, I'm just going to quickly summarize this. So as far as the budget, we've essentially allocated all the grants based on our estimates up to 2024. For 2025, I have $150,000 unallocated. Between the Canada Community Building Fund and the LGFF, it's about $1.72 million a year of grants that we've estimated the town will receive. And then, so some of the changes in funding and movement of grants, you see the one side through the skating rink and the washroom facility and the road program. This is the other side. Again, so for the rec center, we essentially pushed some more funding back into 2024 through LGFF and taking a little funding earlier and move these up to other projects. This is just kind of a summary of the information that we had before. So nothing else on here for projects amounts have changed. There maybe just been some different movement in allocation of grants and funds based on the discussions from the past council meetings. That's on the capital side. Before I summarize the operating, is there any questions?
Can you just back up to the last slide?
This one here?
Yes, so for those items that we discussed at the last council meeting, if we do all that again, what was that percentage increase again? That was 1 point.
On the operating budget?
Yes.
To maintain status quo was 3.87, and the service level enhancements is 0.16%. So right now, after we've made the changes with the road program, totally is sitting at 4.04.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we move on to the operating side. So this again is just a summary of all those items to maintain status quo, 3.87. Again, the biggest item here is the RCMP inflationary costs for 2023. When we're looking at service level enhancements, 0.16%, so this is mostly covered off. This has been adjusted by a few items based on the conversation last week with council. And again, here the summary of 4.04 for 2024, as I just mentioned. Based on the draft budget, it's 3.13 for 2024. Sorry, 4.04 for 2023, 3.13 for 2024, and 2.15 for 2025. Just for council's information, we do pass a 3-year operating plan, so 2024 and 2025 we would have to show a balanced budget. Not set in stone, but it's basically just a building block for the budget discussions next year with council. Okay, so go through a couple options here for council. 2 options. One's a rate increase, second is service level adjustments. So what I've done is just provided 3 options for a rate increase, essentially. So this first option is, if we're looking at taxes, again, it all goes back to your tax strategy, a split between your residential parcels and your non-residential. This is a 1-to-1 split, so for every percentage that the residential increases, non-res would increase the same. So we have a combination here of franchise fees and a tax increase. There's a mill rate stabilization amount here. This would be to fund any deficit in franchise fees for the first 3 months. There are advertising requirements and regulatory requirements with AUC, Alberta Utilities Commission, that has to be filed. So any increase likely would be effective April 1st anyways. So some options for council to consider here: the 1-to-1 ratio. I've gone further and done a 2-to-1 ratio. So if non-res increased by $2, res would increase by $1, right? 2-to-1. And thirdly, a 1.5-to-1. So for every dollar non-residential increases, every dollar residential. So homeowners increase, businesses would increase by 1.5. Those are 3 scenarios I kind of proposed to council. This is not anything, this is not firm. You must pick from one of these. If there's other preference from council, we can evaluate those as well. Just some options and rates that you can see on paper. This is just to quickly summarize, again, back from our first budget meeting, when I talked about tax strategy, where does Colville want to sit in comparison to our other counterparts, residential, non-residential. And again, this non-residential versus residential split. So best practice is usually around 1.5. MGA does allow up to 5.5, 5 to 1. You can see Coldale right now we're on the lower end at 1.28. So this means that compared to other municipalities, our residential base does carry more of the funding than non-residential on a tax ratio split. Again, just some information that we've gone through the previous budget meeting, just some estimates here of what property taxes would be in Coldale for a house in 2022 and a business in 2022. Second option here for council to consider is reduction in municipal services. So for every 1% in tax savings, it's the equivalent of $93,000, just under, in service level reductions. Should town council wish to reduce municipal services, we're just requesting that council provide direction to admin as to what should happen to proceed with this. If this is an option, we recommend some type of communications program to roll this out, just so that residents are informed when they do call the town office or ask our staff questions related to this, just so we do have communication in line for this. And town council, again, under the MGA, we must pass the balanced budget. Couple points. Municipal reserves. It's not recommended by administration to reduce these to balance the budget. We do have a aging infrastructure and an infrastructure deficit, as we've provided to council from recent asset management programs. We believe that maintaining municipal reserves with slight increase every year will help narrow the gap for this infrastructure deficit. So as part of this budget meeting, this agenda item here, we're open the floor to council for discussions and debates. We're just requesting direction to council on how to proceed with balancing the operating budget as part of tonight's meeting. With the regular council meeting on December 12th, that's when we will bring back a balanced budget to council for final approval. Again, if council does pass a final approved budget that night, that's great. If you're still looking for additional information or further discussions, we just have to pass an interim budget before the end of the year and can revisit those discussions next year. That being said, Mr. Mayor, I'll turn it back to council for any questions.
Can you go back to option A with the rate increase, please?
Yeah.
Then I just want you to walk us through that again a little bit slower, and for our residents at home, so that everybody understands. So we're looking at option 4, let's say, where the residential tax is set at 2.07, and the non-residential, like you said earlier, is 1-to-1. So, and then with the franchise fees, this is where, explain about where the franchise fees come into this first slide here then.
Sure. So franchise fees relate to electrical utilities and your natural gas utilities. So electrical would be Fortis, and natural gas would be ATCO. You have the utility lines within the town of Coldale. So franchise fee, we go back to top here, franchise fee, right? So currently natural gas is 15% and electricity is 13%. So these fees are charged on the distribution and transmission charges that are on each bill in the municipality. So distribution and transmission, that's a fairly amount that doesn't change as the price of energy increases if you're on a floating rate versus a fixed rate. So it's not like if a resident is on a floating rate to a fixed rate, you would pay more or less. is everybody essentially pays the same amount for distribution transmission. It would be the same. So if on a bill, a resident pays, for easy math, $100 in distribution transmission for natural gas and electricity, there would be a line item on their bill that says franchise fees paid to the town of Coaldale, and that would be calculated at 15% and 13% of that bill, respectively.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Kyle on option 1, 2, and 3? Okay, moving on to,
Did you want to maybe talk about the splits more than?
yes,
Okay. So non-residential mill rate, again, is at a different mill rate than residential. So as town council, you can set the residential mill rate to change at a different percentage or amount than non-residential. You don't have to change by the same amount. You can put more reliance on one or one less reliance on the other. So a 1-to-1 ratio essentially means that on average, again, these are all based on averages, the average householder in Coaldale would pay, say, just looking at option 4 here, a 2.07% tax increase. While the average business in Coaldale would also pay 2.07% tax increase. So everything is consistent. Your residents and your businesses are essentially paying the same percentage more taxes. 2-to-1 ratio, these are just for numbers for council to consider again, means that if taxes for a resident was to go up by 2%, for a business, they would go up by 4%. So that's that 2 times ratio. We've gone further, we've provided 1.5. So if a resident's taxes was to increase by, say again, easy math, 2%, a business would increase by 3%, so 1.5 times. So those are all funding options that, as I show these previous slides here, council should consider as part of an ultimate tax strategy as to how you want your taxes proportion between your business communities, your non-residential, and your resident tax base. So those are some options to consider. We can go straight additional funding to taxes, or we can reduce the tax increase and offset some of those through franchise fees as well, which the municipality does have control over. Just a reminder for council from our first budget meeting, franchise fees for Coaldale are the lowest of these comparable municipalities as well.
okay, thank you. So one thing I want to bring up first before we go any further is there any appetite to reduce the level of service that we currently have? Anybody, go ahead.
It's an avenue I'd be willing to explore. To what extent? I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not an expert in this, in that field. But again, if we're having troubles keeping the lights on, there's going to be, if there's cuts that have to be made, it's an unfortunate part of the time we're in.
Okay, so just to be clear then, like I'm asking who is in favor of cutting level of services? So Councillor Beekman is in favor.
I'd be in favor of some sort of a cut.
Is there anybody else?
Can I get
Go ahead.
Jack? Sorry, Mayor. When you're talking services, what are you specifically like? Or we're sweeping
Snow removal.
or like paths, stuff like that?
Yes. Councillor Avery.
Thank you, Mayor. So not so much the cutting level of service, but I would like to look at cutting the money we're putting into the savings each year. It's gone up and up and up. We're at just under $2 million. So if we look at cutting that 2%, that's basically our tax increase that we're looking at by just not, in tough times, you don't put as much in the piggy bank. You have to do The same with less. So, you know, rather than cutting a service, let's cut the amount of money we're putting in the piggy bank, because the staff are doing a wonderful job with minimal right now. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, let's not look at cutting the service, but cutting the savings account.
Okay, and we'll touch base with that in a minute then. So for myself, I do not want to see any changes to the level of service that we are currently giving our residents. So I want to get that on the table first and dealt with. So they, I'm going to ask again, are we going to explore minimizing the level of service that we currently have? So right now I got Councillor Beekman that's in favor of doing that. Deputy Mayor Pickering, you have any appetite?
Yeah, I do a little bit. I have a little bit of appetite. Like, because when you're talking services, are you talking like instead of dumping our green bin every week, we cut it back to once every 2 weeks?
Well, I can throw it back at our CFO, like, so that they understand, Kyle, just give some examples of what they can cut if they want.
Sure. So I'm just going to distinguish between two sources. So let's talk about utilities, right? And then we'll talk about, say, municipal funding. So to your example on, say, how often do you dump the green bin, right? So utilities should be a self-sustaining revenue stream. So the amount the residents pay for utilities should cover our water, sewer, waste, and storm. So in theory, if we were to reduce waste collection and ultimately reduce the cost that we have there would be savings that we could pass on to the residents through utilities, right? So that's an option to reduce. You're not necessarily reducing the cost of taxes through that, but you're reducing how much residents are paying each month for utilities. So it's still a cost saving measure. That's not really directly to taxes, but still a savings measure. If we're looking at taxes, so that's areas such as how often grass is cut, how often we spray for weeds, how often the snow is plowed, how often we have community events such as Summerfest or the Night of Lights. We do have funding to other municipalities, other organizations in the town, such as the museum, Handy Bus. Those are all examples. How often we patch our roads, we do road maintenance. Those are all level of services that require tax dollars, right? They're not tied to utilities, so that's more of the tax base. So those are areas that council can explore to reduce level of service. If council does recall, part of the big 11 by 17 package that you had at your last meeting, the back page was a small document that had different levels of services with funding amounts beside to it. So, for example, it had snow removal at $75,000 a year, and the alley rebuild program at $75,000 a year. So those areas where, okay, I don't want to put as much dollars into that. You can reduce that and save taxes to reduce services that way.
Okay. Go ahead, Kellen.
And just further to our CFO here, two items that have been in our budget for the past 4 or 5 years would be the community grant that's taken from a subset of photo radar fine revenue, and there's $35,000 a year that goes in for that annual community grant. So that would be an example of a discretionary service level that council has maintained over the past 5 years, a grant program available to nonprofit organizations. There's also $35,000 under more of a safety-focused wing that we use to fund different upgrades throughout Coaldale, for example, pedestrian flashing lights at different intersections. This is not just a service, but also money provided to the community for community requests in a way that's funded through fine revenue. Together, those equate $70,000. So there's a number of different options of where expenses go in that spreadsheet.
Okay, thank you. So again, level of service. I'm just gonna go around the table here because I want to deal with this first. So Councillor Saylor, you want to change level of service?
No.
Councillor Reese?
No.
I'm a no. Councillor Avery? No. Councillor or Deputy Mayor Pickering?
Now that I look at this,
And Councillor Beekman?
Relevant, but yes, I will.
Okay. So we're not going to cut level of services. So the next option that we have, and to what Councillor Avery was bringing up about taking money out of the reserves. So we are saving money to maintain and look after our infrastructure. So as the CFO said earlier, we are putting money away because we've formulated the asset management plan that we are currently working on through Tim. And we have money going into like he said, a piggy bank that we need to do repairs. So now, if I understand Councillor Avery correctly, he wants to take money out of that savings account to offset the potential tax increase?
Stop take 2% less into the savings. So we're not taking nothing out, we're just not putting as much in this year as we have been in the past. So stop putting as much in, we're not taking it out, it's still gonna be sitting there. And then it gives the next year for our staff to look at possibly we look at extending the life of a piece of equipment by 2 years by doing this. Maybe a grader will be, and I don't know what the life expectancy is, 30 years, maybe it's 32 years. A fire truck, rather than being 20, maybe it's 23 years. And you just get an annual test done on them, and you just expand the life of your equipment by a few years. So, if we start putting less in the savings, we have to look at long-term life expectancy of the equipment, of the capital equipment.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to open it up to Kaylin and Kyle to comment on that recommendation by Councillor Avery. So Kaylin, if you want to go first.
Sure, thank you, Mayor. I was putting my asset management hat on. I do sit on our internal asset management committee, which has representation from each of our departments in the town. And the reality in Coaldale, much like every municipality, I think I can almost say, in North America anyway, we do have an infrastructure deficit where we underfund the amount of money we have to put away to replace the assets that we have. And the gap is significant. So for example, we put $1.72 million, or we receive $1.72 million a year in grants. That could go up, that could go down, but that's the current forecast for the next couple of years. And then we ourselves put away $2 million a year into capital reserve. So together, that's about $3.72 million in purchasing power for our infrastructure. And from previous presentations on the whole asset management side of things, we need to be putting away around $6.7 million a year just to replace our current assets. That doesn't include any new assets that we add to the registry, but that's just to replace the infrastructure that we do have. So, you're looking at close to underfunding of about $3 million a year. So my recommendation is that we need to continue to increase the amount of money we put into reserves each year to continue bridging the gap between what we currently put away and what we need to put away. And I know it's difficult because you're saving for something that you're not going to spend for 20 or 30 years from now. But I do have to advise you that we do have a gap that we need to continue to bridge through prudent funding. It would certainly be helpful if the federal and provincial government tripled the amount of grant money we got each year and helped solve the infrastructure deficit issue that we have. But the fact remains that they too, at other levels of government, have a gap, and they have an infrastructure deficit for their own infrastructure. And so this is a common problem throughout North America, but this is the snapshot of Coaldale's reality. So I just want to leave you with that bird's eye view on my perspective on the reserve funding. I think we've made really good headway, but there's still quite a lot more work to go.
Okay, thank you. Kyle, you have anything to add to that?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Avery, you have any questions on that? So is there any appetite, again, I'm gonna go around the table, that we're going to stop our cap on the amount of money that we're putting into reserves for infrastructure update? So again, maybe any interest in that, Councillor Saber?
Wow, I do have just a question, I guess, to Kayla on that. Would it make that big of a difference if it was only a short amount, like for a short-term fix like he wanted? Like say we just did it for 1 or 2 years and went back, would it create that much of a problem?
That's ultimately council's judgment call to decide if it would be a problem. For every dollar that you take away for solving the operating budget, you're just having to deal with it tomorrow. The other thing that I should add as a variable is that the cost of infrastructure replacement continues to go up quite significantly. So not only are you having to deal with the gap, but you're also having to deal with the short-term reality and cost escalation. And so it would be council's judgment call, but my perspective would be for every dollar that you don't put in, you're having to find later.
Yeah, I didn't think about all that inflation stuff. I'd have to say no, I guess.
Okay, Councillor Reese.
Yeah, just a point of clarification with Kayla, if you don't mind, before I give my answer. Just want to double check. So if we put less in right now, that means that 20 years down the road, we would need like a loan to buy a new hydrovac truck or whatever the case may be at that point, right?
Potentially, like one way around the shortage of what you have in reserves to pay cash for infrastructure replacement would be a loan. But then the question is, how do you pay for your loan payments? And typically that comes in the form of increasing the size of your operating budget. So you can put it into the operating budget as a reserve transfer. So that's still tax supported, but at least you're making interest on the money that you put away to help keep up and hopefully exceed the amount of inflation. Whereas, of course, if you're borrowing, somebody else is making money on the money that you're taking from them versus yourself.
Thank you for that clarification. I would say no.
Okay, thank you. I'm also against taking money, and again, I'm going to say take money out of reserves to cover off a tax increase this year. And I understand what Councillor Avery is saying about not putting as much in, but I'm not in favor of doing that. Councillor Avery, any more comments on that?
So I'm still a yes, that we need to cut back because something's got to be readjusted, because we can't control grocery prices, which they announced they're going to go up another 7% next year, which is approximately $150 to $200 per household, per single household. So you're looking at a couple $1,000. And then you've got carbon tax is going to increase again January 1, which is another 14% on your fuel prices. So there's just not enough money in the piggy bank, in my mind, to continually put money away. There's only one person paying for all that, and that's the person we look at in the mirror. And our wages ain't going up by that much. So we put 5% here, 4% here, and 7% there. Something is going to be missed from each individual, and it's not going to be hopefully food in their kids' mouth. It's going to be paying their property taxes and foreclosure on properties, because you can't afford everything and the increases that are coming at us in the next 12 months. So we need to look at that as a municipality and say, what can we do to help our residents over the next 12 months? So I'm still a yes, we need to take at least 2% less putting into our savings.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor Pickering.
So if we don't do it this year, it doesn't stop us from doing it next year, correct?
That's correct.
And if by chance next year, which things are supposed to happen and we're supposed to be accumulating all these off-street levies and all this happening, because what we're talking about is replacing infrastructure down the road that we don't really, some of it we shouldn't be. You're saying it's going to affect us that much, Galen?
Well, it's difficult for me to forecast the extent of the effect. I'm just having, I'm briefing council on the reality that we have an infrastructure deficit. What you wish to do about that would be council's call. It's difficult to forecast. If you take 2% here, like, to what extent is that going to widen the gap? Like, I don't know that I could comment that definitively on that level of detail, other than we, like every other municipality in North America, have a deficit, and we do need to be aware of what that is. And I don't know if our CFO wants to add
I just wanted
anything
to,
on that.
Great discussion. I just wanted to provide council with some information, some numbers on it. So this is fine print here, but so on this screen, sorry Jordan, I'm using the pointer behind you here, but for 2023 budget, again, it's just under $2 million. So this makeup is about half from utilities and half from taxes. So it's about $1 million through utilities and about $1 million through taxes. So with our funding deficit right now at $375,000, if you were just to solely balance that through reducing municipal reserves, it'd be about 37.5% that they would have to go down. The other $1 million for utilities, if you reduce that, there would be a tax savings, but it could be a utility savings. So just some clarity on the figures for council's discussion.
Okay, thank you.
My question to that is, the next 2 years are dropping, obviously. What are you using for that? Inflation, or you're saying that next year it's only going to be 2.5 instead of 7 this year?
You talk about the rate increases?
Yes.
Yeah, so the rate increase largely is this one item. So our CMP inflationary cost this year is $275,000. So once that's budgeted and we're kind of on track, like that's a one big time hit this year that we're gonna have in the budget going forward. But we don't have that large spike, that $275,000 projected as an increase in the next years. So that's why we're at 4 this year versus say 313 next year. So the RCMP is hitting us hard this year, and then so that needs to be balanced going forward. So.
And just on the RCMP discussion, if the 10th FTE was still in the budget for 2024, that 3.13 would be higher, correct?
Yeah, it'd be maybe 2.5% higher.
So this was after taking the direction from council. Last budget meeting, Kyle made some adjustments to the forecast based on the yes/no directives that we received last meeting, and so the expense associated with that 10th RCMP member was deleted from this updated forecast following that direction.
So if we didn't cut it 2%, if we cut it 1%, we would just change our ratios on how we're doing this. Correct?
Say it again, sorry.
Well, Jason's asking for 2% reduction, right, for this year. So if it went to 1, it would change how we base our taxes.
Thanks for,
It's $2 million total into reserve. So for every 1%, it's $20,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
so then back to my question then. Deputy Mayor Pickering, are you in favor of what Councillor Avery is suggesting?
I'd look at it.
Okay. Councillor Beekman.
I am in favor of it. I believe we can't combat inflation by continually raising prices. Somewhere the buck has to stop, and somewhere somebody has to be fiscally responsible and try to make a change different. It just seems everywhere, like Councillor Avery was alluding to, the cost of everything is going up. Eventually, we're just going to tap people out. If we keep raising this is going to start to drive people out of Coaldale. The fact of the matter is we have other upcoming funding streams. To me, this is a short-term Band-Aid solution. This isn't a long-term. We have other upcoming funding streams coming in the next year or two. For example, I'm going to pick on these 3 items just because there are 3 that I voted against. So on slide 31, It says, for example, a $92,900 reduction in service level results in a 1% municipal tax saving. So instead of taking the 2% out that is going to reserves, or we take that 2% out, in theory, that's 186,000, right? Or, yeah, so 93,000, 2% in theory should be 186,000.
No, so the total of reserves is $2 million. That's that one. So only like a 2% increase of that $2 million is only $40,000.
Okay, so, but if we're looking at, we want to, so 92,900 reduction.
So our total operating budget is anywhere between like 19 and $20 million.
Right.
So reducing that by, so 19 to $20 million total operating budget. Tax support budget is about $9 to $10 million. Right. So if okay, let me start over to clarify. The amount of money that the town collects from taxes is about $9.2, $9.3 million. So if you reduce that by 1%, that's the $93,000 in savings. That's where that comes from.
So if we were to take 1% off our operating, off of the municipal tax for our operating, we could supplement that with, like, I'm just moving numbers here. So if we were to take 186,000 out, so we approved a truck at 60,000, we approved another truck at 60,000, we approved a hoist at 60,000. All three aren't dire necessary needs. That's $180,000. If we took out purchases like that, for instance, for 1 year, we could keep that money still in reserves, and couldn't we then take 186,000 off of what's going into reserve? Like I said, I'm just trying to see if we, some maneuvering. So instead of putting that 186,000, like taking that off of what would go into reserves, we just delay some purchases. The part or the pieces that we approved, they're not dead. They're nice to have, in my opinion. I'd love to have a new truck. Right now, I can't afford it. My truck still works properly at my work. I'd love to replace a hoist. I can't. We're not in the situation right now.
Yeah.
We haven't raised our labor rate at my shop in close to 10 years because we're trying to combat the inflation by not raising prices on everybody else, right? So I get that it's a little, probably a little convoluted here, but I'm just trying to think of ways that if we prevented this purchase, we could stop this money potentially from going in and going over here. I don't know. Thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, so I think I'm following. So you're saying if you were just to postpone one of those projects, or council can use that money to bridge the gap here, essentially, right? Okay, so when it's if you cancel purchase of a truck or a piece of equipment and you saved $100,000, if you cancel it, you have the savings, right? And you can use that money for something else. If you just postpone it, eventually you're going to need the money down the road to buy it. When we're looking at the budget, and this 3.13 for 2024, that's under the assumption that the budget for next year is balanced. So if you cancel a project and you say, okay, I got 100 grand of savings, and I'm going to use that for my budget next year. Well, after you use it for the budget next year, it's gone, right? But you haven't funded that expense going forward. You still have that. Now you have that deficit for 2024. So now that 3.13 plan for next year, that's only going to go up and up and up until you actually cut the expense out, or you cut service levels. So that's where the conversation goes back to, if you want to save money and reduce it, for the budget going forward, it's best to look at items that you're going to spend the money on every year. Because if you just take savings from one item and I'm going to fix this year, we're just going to have an escalated problem next year. So it's an option to consider, but it's going to escalate again the problem next year. Does that kind of help where you're going with it?
Wouldn't it only be an escalated problem if all of a sudden those pieces of equipment were giving us grief?
So in your examples, let's talk about the horse, for example.
Right.
Would you say delay it for a year or cancel it?
I would say we just keep it kind of open as a floater. If it isn't broke, I find it really hard to support fixing it.
Okay, so say we just don't plan on replacing it, right? And we've got the 60 grand for the horse.
Mhm.
Well, let's use easy numbers. Let's just say it's 100.
Right.
And so you've got that $100,000 that, okay, we can reduce the operating budget. So that 375 now is at 275. Well, okay, so we spent 100 grand.
Mhm.
For next year, that 297 is going to say 397, and that 242 for 2025 is going to say 342. So once you spend that 100 grand that you had saved for the horse, that money's gone, but you still have your expenses such as cutting your grass and plowing your streets that you're going to have every year. So those numbers for the next years are just going to escalate, and the tax increase for future years will be higher. So it's a 1 year fix. It's not a sustainable fix for future years. When you're talking, because the hoist is a one-time thing, so think of it as a one-time fix. We're trying to think of like a yearly fix and to forever fix it. Trying to think of expenses that we have every year, right? We have to plow the roads every year. We have to cut the grass every year. We have to, have Summerfest every year, something like that. That is how you reduce it annually going forward by those annual programs. I'm hoping I'm explaining that well.
Somewhat, yes. Though the one part I don't understand completely though is, so if we don't, using the $100,000 example for the hoist, so if we don't spend that 100, all I'm saying is that 100 stays in the bank. So we take 100 off of what we're putting into reserves. That's 100 we can take off the tax increase. So we still have that 100,000. So that 100's not spent. That 100's sitting there, in case. You know what I mean? Like, I guess that's I'm not saying take 100 out and put it over there, because I'm just trying to prevent that 1% coming in. So if we don't spend the 100 out, we don't need the 100 coming in, especially on a purchase that, in my opinion, is more of a want and not a need at this time. Again, we're in a pretty. I just look at the global financial situation we're in, and I'm just trying to think of ways to be creative here.
So, Councillor Beekman, just for clarification, and so the hoist is not a want, like it's a need for us to be able to service all the larger vehicles now that the town of Coldell has. So for them, like when I was over there, when we were decorating the float, like you're crawling underneath some of that equipment because the hoist can't lift it. So the hoist is a need so that they can lift the town's new, like even when I was talking to the mechanic, like even the gravel truck that we use for the snowplow, like they need to crawl under that equipment. Even the hoist that they're looking at will be able to lift the fire truck without water in it, so they can work on it properly. Like they were working on the antique fire truck, they were crawling underneath that thing to do some maintenance on it because they can't get it up on the hoist. So it's about our mechanics doing a proper job and safely. And plus those items that you all brought up, those are all coming, they're not tax supported, they're all coming out of reserves.
No, I'm aware of that. What I was saying was if we pause those, keep those money in reserve, we don't have to replenish reserve for those purchases.
Again, we get into that cycle though, where we're putting this money away so that we're building a bank account so that when we need to do these purchases, that there's money there for that. Like you're doing that borrow from Peter to pay Paul scenario that, as the CFO just explained, it's only going to get worse every year that continues.
Not necessarily borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. I'm not buying something I don't need in 2023 necessarily if I can put it off to 2024 or 2025. I'm not borrowing from one to pay the other. I'm just trying to stop from one having to pay so much. Like that, again, I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but it's an alternative to, it's a way just on those three to stop $180,000 coming out of reserves.
Okay, Councillor Avery had a comment or a question, and then I'll open it up to Kayla. He had a comment as well.
Thank you, Mayor. So just kind of on the lines of where Councillor Beekman is going. So in 2021, we had an operational surplus of $465,748. And then for 2022, another $149,611 that we put into capital, but we can't take from capital put into operational. So if we have an operational surplus, I'm just wondering why we can't have an operational surplus piggy bank that we can go into, so we're not having these types of conversations, because right here in 2 years, there's that we're showing is about $600,000 worth of operational surplus that's gone to capital. And then there was a few other things that we had to take from the 2022 operational for the Civic Square project already, stuff that we didn't budget for in our previous council term. So I'm just wondering why it's such, like, we're very good, or you're very good at putting our grants to where our grants need to go. So I'm just, if you could just clarify that for me and maybe some of the rest of the council.
Sure. So the operational surpluses that we've had in the past 2 years, they've been, I'll go back, I can only remember a couple years back, but okay, so this one we have now, right, the 150 mentioned in the 4 something from before. Those funds were, again, going specifically to capital projects like the rec center and the outdoor skating rink. The year before that, we had an operational surplus, and we used some of those funds to purchase the land formerly known as 7-Eleven. So those funds are going directly to those capital items that they necessarily did not have funding. They didn't have a funding source. They weren't fully funded, so we needed money to go there somehow. So the other alternative is to just cancel some of those larger capital projects, not buy land, or not fulfill some of council's capital projects, and then we don't need the funding to go there. We're not just putting the funding there just because it's going there because it has to be paid somehow. And if the council wants to save any fundings from a year and use that for next year for mill rate stabilization, definitely could do that. But it comes at the cost of canceling other special projects, right? Outdoor skating is a big one we talked about. Skate park's a big one we talked about. That 7-Eleven land, like these are all capital requests from council that is admitted we're just trying to fund and balance. So we can certainly do, as you mentioned, but again, if we have to look at canceling other projects that council may want to pursue.
So just one follow-up then. So is a grant specific to, I'll pick on the back truck instead of the hoist. Is a grant specific to the back truck, or can that be put into operation? So if that project was canceled, can that grant be put into operational, or is that specific for capital?
So we're just talking the grants, not specifically onto the back truck, but onto the way the grants work. So the capital grants, they need to fund anything that's not operational in a sense, but you want to fix your sidewalks or repair your roads or fix your sewer and your water. Those are items that we have in our operational budget that are funded by utilities and taxes. But if you said I didn't want to do this, I'll pick on the outdoor skating rink because that's the big one for 2023. If you said I don't want to do that, I'm going to take all my grants and put them to fixing my roads and my sidewalks, which are in my operating budget, you could do that. But again, it comes at a cost. Now you can do that to fund some of your operational budget because you do have capital expenses for grants in your operational budget. But it just comes back to then which projects do we want to cancel, right? So it's one or the other, kind of.
Kaylin.
I've got a lot of chicken scratch here in front of me, so I just a couple of thoughts. I guess I'll just start with Councillor Avery's comments here, just because they're the most recent. The operating surpluses that we've had, there's different reasons for them each year. For example, this year, the primary driver for the operating surplus would be staff vacancies. And the only reason it's a surplus is because we had staff step up and do multiple roles throughout the year without being compensated any extra. That was as opposed to hiring temporary staff or contracted services, which would have been an expense to bridge the gap. So I look at the operating surplus not so much as an operating budget with a lot of padding, but as hardworking staff stepping up, doing multiple roles for no extra money. That's the single biggest reason that we have the surpluses that we do, we could and we do have the option of hiring temporary staff or contracted services, but logistically it's difficult when you have only a year to try to get someone on board. Who do you find? How long do they stay? If it's temporary work, they're probably still holding out for a permanent position. So how long are they going to stay for the temporary backfill? And so that's something that I just wanted to offer in terms of a reason. And you don't want to forecast the use or the assume that you're going to have necessarily an operating surplus, because you may not. It's difficult to you hope that you don't, because you hope that you're fully staffed for the whole year, but things do happen. But the operating surplus, I would say, like, they have indirectly helped our operating budget, because they have helped fund capital budgets that have gone over budget. And had we not had the good fortune of operating surplus, like say for the high school rec center project, if it didn't help chip away at the capital cost overrun from our previous estimates, we would have had to have found that money elsewhere, which would be code for the taxpayer. More debt equals more payments. We're taking out of reserves to balance that budget. Well, then if you're going to do road resurfacing, if you've spent the money on your reserves to bridge that gap, how are you going to fund that? And so the operating surpluses, I would say, if you follow the path, they do actually help your operating budget going forward, because it helps you deal with some of the unforeseen capital expenditures. So just wanted to offer a little bit of perspective on that, if that's helpful. And then Councillor Beekman, I think I understand what you're saying, but I just want to summarize to make sure. So you're suggesting that we table, let's say, a list of equipment purchases, the hoist and 2 others, and just for easy math for my sake, we'll say that's $100,000. What you're suggesting is that we take that $100,000 because we're not making the purchases, put it toward the deficit to reduce the amount of taxes that are needed, still put away the same amount into reserve that we were planning to put away. Is that basically how you're suggesting that we trade?
Either that, or if we don't make the purchase, if the money goes out, there's no reason to replenish the money, therefore we can take that money off of what comes in.
Okay.
So either we pay it with that and then replenish it, or we just remove that middle transaction right out of there. If money is not going out, there's no need for the money to go in.
Okay. No, I think I understand. Like the hard part is there's still money coming out of the equipment account. Mm-hmm. Even though you're not buying the asset, we might need it in 2 or 3 years from now, and that's where you might pay the consequence of deleting an expenditure, because we might need the hoist. It might fail in 2 to 3 years, and the money that you would have used to spend on the hoist, you actually used to balance the budget a few years prior. So you're having to take out of that reserve, and what it does is you have less available to replace the fleet that you have. And eventually, you could come up short relative to the amount of needs coming down the pipe over a 10-year period. That would be the risk by making that trade. But I just want to make sure that I understood your equation correctly.
So my equation is not necessarily depleting reserves. My equation was just not making the expenses. The reserves are still going to stay the same. It's just if we're not making the expenses, we don't have to replenish that reserve. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying we're going to take that $100,000 out and put it towards this, and then we have this $100,000 hole we can't backfill if all of a sudden, just using the hoist as an example, the hoist fails, right? The money's still there. And unfortunately, yes, then we're going to have to increase that 2% back to revenue, the following year, right? Like I said, I'm just looking at a short-term, something to kind of bridge the gap here. We do have increased revenue, or the potential for increased revenue in the next couple of years. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but it's maybe something to think about. Thank you.
I just put on the slide just so council can see. This is just the summary of where we do put funds to reserves. So just information as you debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship, or thank you, Mayor, and through the council. First of all, I wanted to apologize for my lateness. I should have looked at the time change closer on my agenda. Further to the conversation at this time. Just wanted to ask through to either Kyle or Kaylin, on some of these timely purchases, such as the lift. I know in listening to the town staff a year ago when we toured the shop, and sort of, I think they had some ideas for moving forward with that particular item. And I guess my question is being that it wasn't budgeted for a year ago, obviously there was a plan or a schedule for replacement over a year ago or even 2 years ago that would have set this in motion for 2023. Would that be something that you were focusing on in terms of that expenditure?
Yeah, the lift specifically was an item that, if we refer back to notes from last year's budget meeting, it was brought up as this is a future item. So we always look at our fleet and heavy equipment and the vehicles on the schedule base. So the staff who run those programs, run that equipment, have done a good job at projecting when we're going to have to replace the equipment. It's not a perfect science that we can hammer down to the exact day that this vehicle is going to fail and make sure we have another one ready to go to replace in that minute. But yes, it's a kind of an estimated schedule that we have though.
So these predictable type of schedules are really should be the normal for council to plan for the coming year. And just speaking with Mayor about even purchases of trucks, I think that's a prudent, wise plan, and also keeping that schedule ongoing, so we're not losing sight of what we need to spend the right money on the right things.
Okay, thank you. So back to Councillor Avery's suggestion, instead of putting away that 1.926 million this year, you want to take enough off of that to put towards that. So again, we're going to go around the table regarding this. Like, I don't want to put it to a vote. We'll just like this. We're going to ratify this next week, so that's when we'll do the voting on this. But who is in favor of Councillor Avery's suggestion? I'll start with Councillor Beekman.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Pickering.
Yes.
Jason, we already know. Jordan?
I would entertain seeing it. I would like to maybe see some sort of calculation of what it will actually do a few years down the road if we don't do it. I'd like to kind of see what our savings would look like if we stayed and what our savings would look like if we did this.
Well, the savings is based on what we need to do with our infrastructure. Like, that's what it's there for. So like at the last meeting, we're talking about streets and avenues that people want upgraded. They want new asphalt, and Justin went into that as far as, if you're going to redo the asphalt, we got to do the deep services. Like we have so many.
I'm a no, but I wouldn't mind seeing the numbers.
Well,
Go ahead. I'll just pick up one item. So on the fleet and heavy equipment here, we all see that operations and heavy equipment at $200,000 a year. So that $200,000 a year is essentially to fund all the equipment that these operations guys use, right, for all their day-to-day stuff. So if we look at the funding deficit right now, we're short at $375,000. Like, okay, we want to save $100,000. We want to cut that in half, right? So that means all the equipment that we're estimating to replace, if it's over 15 years, or 20 years, or 25 years, whatever that is, you can essentially we have to use that equipment for twice as long. So if a grader was supposed to last for 15 years, now that we have to make that last 30 years, which is going to, as we've discussed plenty of times with the hydrovac too, going to add more cost to your operating budget when you have to fix it. Backhoe or the trucks. If it's designed for 20 years, we now have to make it last for 40 years if we cut the funding in half. That's just an easy math example for this.
Yeah, no, if it's gonna be that long, then I'm not.
But we're talking 2%, not 50.
Well, 2% of 2 million is only 40,000, so.
So on that note, next year, if we take in another $300,000 in taxes, we can't take that money and put it back in there?
We're estimating next year that we'll have an additional $200,000 from new growth next year. So we do estimate new growth for future years as well.
That's what we're seeing is we're shifting for 1 year. Like I noticed on that, you got the pool, $15,000. We're spending $500,000 next year into it. Why are we putting this 15 in there? Is that for the next pool, or is that for this pool, or
Yeah, so,
we shouldn't be doing anymore after we've spent all this money?
well, after all these facilities, right, they sometimes do have stuff that breaks, they do have items that break and they need small renovations and whatnot. You know, the library needs a new air conditioning unit. This is designed for those small breaks and smaller renovations and not the actual like large capital improvements and fixtures to the project. So as we fix the pool, it's still possible that there's going to be small or minor repairs that need to come up that we need this funding for. So that's what this funding is designed for. You can still reduce it. It's just, you know, if something breaks, council has to be okay. If it breaks, then we don't have the service, or there's going to be a delay in fixing the service. That's the only offset to it.
Kaylin?
Yeah, just as a quick, for instance, on the pool side, if the boiler goes, for example, so if you approve the capital upgrades to the pool, you know, a boiler or some other piece of critical infrastructure in that facility goes down, you don't want to close the entire facility simply because there isn't an available pool to, no pun intended, to grab from in order to keep the facility operational, or furnace or roof leak, something like that.
Okay, thank you. That answers your question, and Councillor Saylor?
Yeah.
Councillor Chapman?
I'd be interested to hear what the proposal was.
Well, what we were talking about before you arrived was that Councillor Avery's suggestion was that, like right now, we are going to be putting away $1,926,688 into reserves. And there was discussion around the table about, instead of putting that much into reserves, holding some back for mill rate stabilization. And then our CFO and CAO were just explaining what happens if we don't keep continuing to put money into reserves.
No, I'm not in favor of reducing that.
Thank you. Councillor Reese?
Well, in order just to keep the town operating at its current level right now, I don't see another way around it. So I say we have to keep putting money in reserves.
Okay, thank you. And then prior to your arrival, we went around the table and talked about our level of service that we currently have, if we were going to cut that back, and majority of council felt that we'd keep everything the same.
I support that as well.
Okay, thank you. So then, for some help on this then, so if we go back to the options for the tax increase, so for the residential and non-residential split, so you know, two that come out for me is option 8 and option 12. So option 8, that's a 2-to-1. So then our residential tax base will go up 1.77%, and the non-residential tax 3.54%. And then the next one, option 12, is a 1.5-to-1. So then the residential goes up 1.91, and the non-residential tax 2.87. So Kyle, just refresh our memory. Last year we raised the non-residential how much?
The non-residential last year was 0.56.
Yeah.
Residential is 0.56, non-residential is 4.16. A large reason for that discussion last year was based on the tax ratio that Colville saw was low.
What was low?
So if we look at this from discussions last year with council, it was based on the tax strategy. when we talk about tax strategy, this is a tax strategy. Where do you want your non-residential rate to be versus your residential rate? So you can see Lethbridge on the far left, right? That's 2.49. That means their non-residential mill rate, so their business mill rate is 2.4 times larger than what their residential mill rate is. So in Lethbridge, their residential, so the household is about the same as Coaldale. Their non-res is over 20 points, right? So it's 2.4 times higher. Versus on the far right, if you look at Morinville, they're 1.1. So that means that their business and their resident household tax rate is almost even, right? So it's where council wants to be as far as that strategy. Back to the options.
So then option 12 with the 3% increase on the franchise fees, we're looking at 1.91 residential and a 2.87 non-residential all in, then correct, Kyle?
That would get you your balanced budget, yes.
Okay, I'll open it up to council. Everybody had this in their package with the 12 options. Any discussion on any of this? Like Councillor Avery, I know you want to have a 0% increase.
And I think we need to look at that same sheet we looked at last week. And Councillor Bateman has brought it up again this week about what do we need to have. We've been. I'm going to pick on the sun truck. It's the back truck is something that do we need to have it, or is it okay having a contractor RFPing it for the amount of hours that we would need it, rather than having a piece of equipment sit for 16 or 20 weeks? Who's going to operate this truck? Because right now they're all our staff are stretched thin, working their backsides off. So you put another piece of equipment in there, who's going to operate that piece of equipment? Next year we're going to be then looking at staffing for that truck. And so I think there's other options, and use Councillor Beekman's model. You take that $400,000 and put that into a stabilization, and the money's already built in the operational side to contract it, I would think. So, because it's not, our operational budget is not lower this year than it was last year. So that money hasn't been taken out. So it's still there for that vac truck contract to come and do the work. So I know, I just think there's ways that we can.
So 2 comments on that back truck then. So number 1, that is not tax supported, that's coming out of reserves. And number 2, the document that Justin put together that explained the different scenarios, if we buy it, the life of the truck, if we lease one, or if we contract it out. And do you want Justin to go through that again?
No, I read the whole document, and so you depreciate a truck at $20,000 a year, and you're paying somebody $40,000 to come in and operate it for you. You're still, in the end of 20 years, you're still going to be ahead on this piece of equipment, because we don't have any wear and tear and fuel and operator and all of the other stuff that is part of that big picture of it.
Go ahead, Kalen.
Just, one comment, given the cost per hour of what hydrovacs run, if we were to hire a contractor to do the full scope of maintenance that's required as part of our maintenance program, you would have to increase the amount of money in the operating budget to pay the bill from the contractor. The only way for it to balance out in the scenario that you identified is we would just have to do less work with it, given the amount per hour that a contractor would charge. So that's the problem, is if we do the full scope of work that's needed, given the amount of infrastructure we have, at that dollar amount per hour, that will be more dollars in total that you'll need to make up in your operating budget. Unless you want to reduce the service level, reduce the maintenance standard, the amount of work that gets done. You get less done because of the higher dollar amount per hour in order to make it balance operationally, if that follows.
Councillor Beekman.
Thank you. I guess my question, just since we're talking about the vac truck, I get the need for the vac truck, but is the vac truck a need to own in 2023, or is this something we can own in like 2025? You know, going back to my example of not taking money out of reserves and then having to replenish it. So if we don't buy the vac truck at $400,000 and that money stays in reserve, so we don't have to fund that $400,000, we contract that service out for 2 years. Okay, we're still going to be at the same cost of what we would be had we paid for the vac truck, but in 2 years we could be in better financial standing that then we can afford to make that purchase. I'm not saying the vac truck isn't necessary. I'm just saying, is it a 2023 need or is it a 2023 want?
It's a 2023 need, and it's not tax supported. The money is in the reserves to pay for that truck.
I understand that. What we've been trying to see is what we can, how much we can stop from going into reserves to offset how much the total income tax or the total property tax is. So I know we're not paying for the vac truck out of taxes, but in turn we are, because it's in reserves. So if we're taking that $400,000 out of reserves, we have to replenish that reserves, and we replenish those reserves through taxes.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, no, I think I wrapped my head around, you know, your thought process, and
Right.
I do understand. Again, if we look at our 10-year capital replacement plan for equipment, the issue with tabling a purchase is that the number of things that you may need to buy over a 10-year period doesn't go down, but the amount of total available money that you have in that equipment reserve isn't necessarily going up. And so your number of liabilities or potential expenses, you're not chipping away at it by making the acquisition of these pieces of equipment that you may need a few years from now. But a few years from now, there's going to be other pieces of equipment in our 10-year replacement plan that will also be coming up for consideration, and the total amount of money available for those pieces of equipment isn't going to increase by simply tabling something. If you were to say we're not buying a vac truck ever, it would work better in your scenario. Then we might need one a bit later, but we're not going to buy it now if you want to use any of the money that's set aside for that piece of equipment to offset your operating budget, be that with a reduction in reserve transfers or otherwise. So that's just the reality, is that you got to look at it in terms of what purchases you might be making over a multi-year period, just because you might have to pay the piper at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Deputy Mayor Pickering.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn. So what I'm gathering here is, if we buy the vac truck for the suggested amount, last year we spent $55,000 on contracting one out. So you budget, I thought we did.
Justin, just sit at the table.
Good evening, Justin Ferguson, Director of Operational Services. So this is that sheet I gave council last year. Last year and the year before we spent about $13,000 on the critical catch basins. That's just maintaining the ones near the highway and the ones that see the most gravel and salt. And that's really the big idea about maintaining storm infrastructure. You want to keep as much salt, gravel, sand, and street crime under your storm ponds as possible.
So that's all we spent with hydrovac truck last
Just
year.
the critical ones.
Well, I'm meaning total.
That's the big contracted services for that service was $13,000.
Yeah, but
Go ahead, Caleb.
I think what Councillor Pickering is wanting to know is, if you did everything that you needed to do in your maintenance program at the contracted rate per hour, what would that cost per annum? That's the question.
If we did everything that the storm catch basin program that is part of our maintenance requirements would be about $50,000. And then in the sheet I explained it'd be about $40,000, because if we didn't have a back truck, there'd be about $10,000 in cost a year.
Yeah, because that's what I'm after.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah, because what I'm after is, if you're going to spend $50,000 or $55,000 next year, I understand why you want one, but I also want to know you budgeted in to run this truck with a man, so we're not going to get hit with a surprise that Darren's too busy, he can't run this truck.
Yes, I did touch on that. Yeah, we have it built into our operations budget already, into an operations plan already.
So we're secure that if we buy this truck, you guys should be able to run all year without coming back to us and saying,
It's not going to be running all year, but yes, I will not come back and ask for a staff member for this piece of equipment.
okay.
And just to be clear too, like, again, I can't say this enough. It's not tax supported, it's out of reserves. And we already went around the table and
Yeah.
majority of us already said we're not gonna take away from that money that's going into reserves. So that takes us back to the options how we're gonna figure out how we're going to do the non-residential and the residential tax. Like, as far as we're looking at a tax increase, I'm sorry. There's no way around that. Like, every municipality that, like, I went on, checked with the other municipalities in southern Alberta, everybody is looking at a tax increase. Like, if we want to take money out of our piggy bank, as people refer to it as, to try to stabilize the mill rate, that's just a Band-Aid that's going to have to get ripped off next year or the year after. So I think if we can do the one of these options, like, again, I'm going to go back to option 12, the 1.5 to 1 split. We're looking at a 1.91% residential tax increase. Go ahead, Councillor Rees.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a question. You had mentioned that option 12 would balance the budget.
Mhm.
Option 8, does that balance the budget?
Yeah, all 3 of these tables here, like these would all balance the budget.
Okay.
So they're just different options that you can choose from.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Kalen, go ahead.
This might be a silly question, but my assumption is that if the increased franchise fee, people wouldn't receive or notice an increase on their invoice until the start of Q2, 2023.
That's what
So-
we estimate, yeah. So that's why you would have that mill rate stabilization to get you through that lost revenue for the first 3 months.
Right.
46.5.
So in the same way that we're not receiving that revenue, they're not incurring that expense.
Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Kalen's started to answer my question. My point on the franchise fees, I feel that would probably be our most logical way of handling a number of things, so that the non-residential and the residential side is much more balanced that way, that it's franchise fees are equal all the way across the board, rather than trying to adjust different rates for non-residential versus residential. Would that be correct?
So franchise fees, again, they're calculated based on the distribution and transmission charges. So how much power and gas that site requires. So if we're considering a franchise fee increase, if you have a $10 million processing facility or a $300,000 house, the distribution charges are much different, right? So like,
Okay.
so the bigger you use, the more power, the more gas you have, the bigger your meter is, the bigger your site. It's just like taxes. Those facilities and areas will pay more on franchise fees versus a single family house that has smaller usage, right? So it's not like your biggest business in Coalville is going to pay the same as your smallest taxpayer, right? As the value of the property essentially goes up because you're bigger and you require more demand, the curve for franchise fees and the cost goes up as well.
Thank you. I was thinking about this over the weekend, and of course I felt that might be the one item that is most understandable. And I mean, most people, when you're looking at their bills, obviously are going to look at the property tax and see where it is compared to the year before. So like you say, franchise fees it's not that it's a hidden cost, but I think the 3%, for example, would certainly help adjust for that, any other discrepancies, so that we can see that up front rather than back.
Councillor Avery.
Thank you, Mayor. And so this 4.7% increase that we'd be looking at does not include the 6.2 or whatever it is for utilities that's coming January 1st, correct?
No, this is just for taxes. Yeah.
So that's something we got to keep in mind, that there's already a 6.2% increase coming to our residents January 1st
In utilities.
in utilities.
That's the goal for the debenture for the wastewater payment. Okay, so back to just the residential and non-residential options that we have from 1 to 12. Go ahead, Councillor Reese.
Thank you, Mayor. I think I would go with option 8 if these are what we taught. I think I would go with option 8.
So option 8 is 1.77% residential, and then it'll be a 2 to 1. So then the non-residential will double that, so to 3.54. And what did we raise the non-residential last year, Kyle?
4.16%.
Go ahead, Troy.
Thank you, Mayor. I personally would go with option 12 if I had to choose, simply because we did do a higher hit to the businesses last year. There was a lot lower residential, so I feel that 1.5 is a little bit fairer.
Okay, thank you. I also agree with that, doing the 1.5 to 1 split. And I concur with what Councillor Saylor said with the increase that we did last year of 4.16 to the non-residential. Like between Coldell and, to use the city of Lethbridge, we're around 50% less on the non-residential.
Our municipal is greater than 50% cheaper. So the city is about 20 points and Coldale is about 10 points.
Right. Okay, thank you. So the two scenarios, I'm going to put this up for a vote then. So Councillor Reese' suggestion is option 8, a 2 to 1 split, where the residential tax is 1.77, non-residential 3.54. Who is in favor of option 8? Councillor Reese and Deputy Mayor Pickering. Option 12, Councillor Saylor suggests, where the residential tax, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were asking.
No, so residential tax of 1.91 and non-residential tax 2.87. Who is in favor of that one? Okay, so that one is not a no-go either. So like this isn't the formal motion that we're doing here. We're just kind of pulling at straws here. So I'll open it back up to either Councillor Avery, Deputy Mayor Pickering, or Councillor Beekman, if you have any suggestions of any of those 12 options.
If we're gonna do a tax increase, I'm looking at option 8 too, due to the fact that the residential people are supporting 90%, or what is it, 86% of the taxes in this town. That goes for any new pavement that's done in the industrial park, any new pavement that's done uptown, any sidewalks we clean, anything we do is based on residential paying for business tax.
Commercial businesses are also a lot bigger and they're paying a lot more compared to a house.
They also write off their taxes. They can increase their revenue if they want. How many people here are going to be able to say, I'm going to increase go to my staff and are going to get a 10% increase in their wages to cover this? They're not. So that's my option.
Okay, so I'll open it up again. Any more discussion on option 8? That's a 2 to 1 split, 1.77 residential, non-residential 3.54. Who is in favor of option 8? Okay, we're going to be at a stalemate here, so go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. I would really like to see options being brought back with some of Councillor Beekman's recommendations. And I know we voted, a majority voted in favor of getting some of those operational grant funded, but that grant funded is also, from that one slide, some of the money that we have put away over the years So I'd really like to look at more of a mill stabilization with some of those recommendations that Councillor Beekman brought forward, and have an option 13 and 14 to look at.
So again, to be clear then, like now we're gonna revisit minimizing the amount of money going into reserves this year?
No, that's not what Councillor Beekman said. He said if we put off the purchase of, do we need 2 pickup trucks next year? Does rec need one next year? So that's $60,000. Do we need the hoist next year? That's $60,000. So now we're 1.2%. So your residential can be
So, but then you're,
1.02.
but what you're saying, and if I understand, you're gonna use that money to stabilize the mill rate.
Yes.
So you're taking money out of reserves to do that.
But you're still putting your full money back into reserves.
Okay, so then do we need to go through the whole cycle again about how that compounds down the road?
No, I completely understand that.
Okay,
I completely understand what next year and how next year is going to affect each and every resident in Coaldale. And I respect that Lethbridge went up 5%, and Tabor's going up, and Nobleford's not. And but I choose to stay in Coaldale. This is my community, and this is where I need to make sure taxes are within reason. We always forget about the 120 that we have as a levy onto our taxes. So when our taxes are not less than Lethbridge, when you put that $120 into our percentage in our tax base, it's there. We can't forget about the money that we're already pulling from our residents, and that levy was put there for a reason, so it was very clear to the residents that's where that portion of their tax dollar was going, to that rec facility. But it's still a tax that we're charging them.
that's correct, and that was something that was done and voted on and passed, and now that's something that we're paying for, that we can't go back and revisit that. But my comment is that it's important to understand that we're going to maintain the current levels that we all agree, well, majority of us agree to do that. And that alone, to maintain what we have now, and Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, is 3.87%, correct?
3.87.
Yeah, so 3.87, just to keep the lights on and the buildings heated and keep the same level of services. That's not the fault of this council, that's inflation. And I apologize that we can't deal with that. Like, it's something that every municipality has to deal with. And if you want to go into reserves to try and stabilize the mill rate by that, we've had that discussion. That doesn't work. It just compounds and compounds, and it comes back to haunt us. So we have options in front of us, and like with the franchise fees, for myself personally, for getting a 1.77 residential tax increase or a 1.91, it's the world we live in. I'm sorry. And I'm not sure, other than not purchasing vehicles, to me that's just taking money out of reserve for the stabilization. That doesn't work. So I'm going to ask again around the table, any suggestions on these options that are before us?
I'm just going to mention, I think our best wiggle room is our franchise fees.
Yeah, and we've got 3%.
So I think that's probably our most logical way to go. I mean, obviously people are going to be more efficient with some of their utility rates over the next year. I know that those costs are going to be spoken to coming up, but I think that's probably our best way of handling all these increases in order to keep that level of service, because I do agree that maintaining our roads and streets and sidewalks is probably one of council's highest priorities, and I don't want to lose sight of that as our town grows we've got streets that haven't been touched in 25, 30 years, and so we're growing in other areas, but we need to keep that pace.
Kaylin, go ahead.
Just circling back to the November 15th budget meeting, and comparatively for franchise fee, City of Lethbridge is at 16% for electricity. Coaldale's currently at 13%. City of Lethbridge is at 27% for natural gas. Coaldale's currently at 15%. And then Tabor, for instance, is at 18% for electricity. Coaldale 13%. And Tabor at 18% for natural gas. Coaldale at 15%. So when you look at,
If we're on slides.
oh, yes, that slide. So whether it's 0, 1, 2, 3, or some other number determined by council, here's the comparative spreadsheet on the franchise fee side.
And we're looking at 3%. Councillor Saylor.
Could we do, would it make much effect if you did like 3% and then 5% on the natural gas? Instead of doing 3 and 3, would that do much or no?
Well, I'm going to call it what it is. It's a hidden tax. So you put it on the front end or the back end. Councillor Reese.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. I like Councillor Avery and Councillor Beacon. I don't want to see taxes go up, but not in the least. But it's the times we live in, and everywhere is going up. And Coaldale is still, people are still moving here. We need to keep our operations going. So again, I'm gonna say I would go for probably option 8. That's where
So
I'm standing.
So then option 8 again, so you understand, and non-residential is going to pay double of what the residential pays. And then option 12 is the next best one.
That's to try to save our residents who, like Deputy Mayor said, 80%. 80% is what the non-residential pay.
That's correct.
If we lose 1%, if 10 people move out of town, there it is, right there.
Even if they could move somewhere, but they're going to be facing the same tax increase, unfortunately, no matter where we're going. It's everywhere.
But for people that work in Lethbridge and drive,
Kaylin, go ahead.
if they move, right, we lose that. So that's why I'm agreeing with you on this.
Well, just so you know, if they're going to move to Lethbridge, you're looking at 5.1% tax increase in Lethbridge.
But they'll save on.
That's what I was saying.
They'll save on all their driving and all the services that Lethbridge offer too. So we have to always look at that as why they moved to Coaldale.
Small town living. Kaylin, you had a comment?
No,
Okay.
I withdraw.
Okay, we got 12 options before us. I'm opening up the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn. I'm sticking with option 8.
Okay, let's revisit this then. Option 8, so that's a 2-to-1 split. Residential tax 1.77, non-residential 3.54. So Kyle, just for clarification, tell us what we can do before we set the tax rate next year.
Sure. So the tax rate will be set by council in April and May. Once then the tax assessment bills are sent out in June. So if council, say in February or in 2023, wants to cut an area or increase an area or amend the budget somehow, the tax rate is not set until May. So if something happened between then and now, you could always change it based on your information. So you'll set the tax rate in May, but information now is needed to balance the budget. And so based on how we project the tax ratio to go, this would be information to balance that budget. But again, you're not setting the rates until May, so you could change your direction by then.
Thank you. And I was looking for just clarification so everybody understands that just to meet MGA requirements, we have to have a budget in place by the end of this year. So with that being said, then we can pick one of these and then we can revisit that again in the new year before we set the tax. Everybody understand that?
Just a
Okay.
question, Mayor, if I may, looking at those splits now, last year, again, we increased 4.16 on the non-residential side, and the residential side was
0.56.
0.56. So we have done quite an increase for the non-residential side compared to residential last year. So here's another option here. Obviously, it's number 2 or number 4, and that's an equal right across the board, which breaks down the non-residential side to 2.07 instead of 3. But it does increase the residential side.
And that's what we're trying to avoid, to keep the residential side down. So
Well, again, the non-residential took a bigger hit last year in terms of that increase than residential side.
point taken. Okay, so based on my question to our CFO that we can revisit this before we set the tax rate next year, then for myself, I would be in favor of option 8 then the 2-to-1 split. And then that way we can meet our requirements and then we can revisit this in the new year.
Just a point of clarity, Mayor, on the tax rates, yes, correct. We would just need to know for the franchise fees. So we would
Yes.
just need to know for the franchise
Yep.
fees.
So if we go with, let's say, to pick one, option 8, the 3%
Yeah.
franchise fee is part of that, so. Okay, so who would be in favor of option 8, the 2-to-1 split, residential 1.77, non-residential 3.54? Put your hand up if you're in favor. Okay. Go ahead.
Have to stick with option 12. I understand where they're coming from, but just like you say, it's 80%. Who supports your local hockey teams? Who's going to support the Summerfest? Who's doing that? You lose one big business, there's a huge chunk of your tax right there as well. So,
Councillor Reese.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn. Respectfully, Councillor Saylor, I do wonder if the reason you're after that is because of your own personal business.
respectfully, Lisa, I'm paying on both no matter what. So,
There's some of us that have commercial buildings as well, so. Okay, so then let's go back to option 12. 1.5-to-1 split, residential tax 1.91%, non-residential 2.87. And again, we can revisit this in the new year. All those in favor of that one?
I'm going with even split number 4.
Okay, well then,
Would it be appropriate to, if council wish to go with the rate increase, to direct the administration for 3% franchise fees to balance that portion, and then the tax rate ratio can be revisited in April if council wishes that as an option.
okay, say that again now.
If you provide direction as to you want a 3% increase in the franchise fees, we could proceed with that. We could table the actual discussion of how we'll split the rate increases until April, if council wishes.
So how are we going to have a balanced budget by doing that?
You would have to say that the balance will come from a tax increase. How you allocate that tax increase between residential and non-residential, you can figure out another day. But essentially, you're calling the balance left, it would have to be tax increase. How you split it, you can figure that out at a different day, or you can decide today. Just providing some help to you.
So then that discussion would be held, like you said, in April.
In April, when we bring first reading of the mill rate bylaw to council, yeah. But at that point, the budget and the funding required for the tax increase is essentially set. Then the mill rate has to be adjusted for that. That isn't the time in April that we can come back and say we want to reduce the budget by so much, because it's very difficult when we're already operating. So you could essentially just say it's a tax increase for the balance we need left, and establish the rates at April.
I've never heard of that before.
Well, like most, like say City Lethbridge, they just say it's a 5% increase right now because it's an average. But they have the ability, like every other municipality in April, to change the ratio if they want to.
I understand that.
So, if you don't have to, you could just say it's a. Well, I don't want to say, just say it's a 1-to-1 4% tax increase, because that could set a bad narrative then when you actually change it. So,
Kayla, any other comment?
I'm just thinking in terms of press releases. A lot of municipalities have come out, they passed the budget at this increase. There will be a expectation in the public of what that increase is going to be. So if council wants to table what the proportion is between residential and non-residential and make that decision in April, I think some idea of what kind of tax increase is needed to balance the budget is likely going to be a resident expectation. And to Kyle's point, the 2.07 is the quick answer for now, but the ratio of that could be subject to change in April when council decides how much gets put on non-residential versus residential. Because to say, well, we don't know, I don't know that that's a real good rollout strategy. So you may have to just say it's 207 to make it easy for now, and then decide the ratio later. And that would be an acceptable, clear communication rollout. But I'm trying to be mindful of
I
how
like
best
that
to
idea.
explain this.
that's what I meant to say.
Yeah, no, like,
Yeah.
Kyle got me on the scent trail, so.
So then, again, just for the sake of this meeting, option 4, a 1-to-1 split, 2.07 for residential and 2.07 for non-residential, with the explanation that our CFO made, that I alluded to earlier, that we can change that in April. So that'll just get us to meet our requirements along with the 3% franchise fees, and then we can revisit this in the new year. Who is not in favor of that idea? Okay, so someone's not understanding what can be done here. Like, seriously. So this is not written in stone. This is just to get us done for what we need to do for the end of the year. And then this will get revisited and hashed out prior to when the tax notices go out, so in April.
I understand that. I just think that doing it that way sets a bad precedent.
In what way?
It's just my opinion.
But I'm asking, where are you coming from with this precedent? What do you mean by that?
I just think that we need to have something a little bit more concrete moving forward from this meeting.
We just need a placeholder.
Yeah.
Kaylin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Having sat in negotiations before, I want to make a lot of extra work for our CFO, but what would council's thoughts be on taking the average of option 8 and option 12? I know 12 options is quite a lot already, but I'm just seeing a lot of 3 3s or 4 3s in the wrong direction, and just in the interest of helping move things along. Is that a compromise that different councils?
Yeah, it'll give us a
councillors
number.
could
It'll
work
give
with?
us a number to carry over, but you have the capability of giving us that number now?
In 2 minutes I can. Go ahead, 1 minute, yeah.
was gonna give him 3 minutes, but that's pretty good.
Just a question through to Kaylin. When we talk about 3.87, that's a combined interest rate. If we're going, when the public's reading the paper, you're talking about on the street, what is the tax increase going to be? 3.87 combined?
Yes, but it also assumes no increase in franchise fees. Yeah, so that's purely if council wished to balance the budget using the same tax increase rate for both res and non-resident.
And without increasing franchise fees.
That's right. The 3.87 is just to keep everything status quo.
Okay, so the split, the two options, so it would be a 1.75 ratio to 1. On the residential side, it would be 1.84%.
Okay, one more time, please.
1.84% for residential and 3.22 for non-residential. So 1.84 on the residential and 3.22 on the business side.
And then a 3% franchise fee.
Yes.
Again, this is just a placeholder, and then we can revisit this in the new year. Deputy Mayor Pickering.
I'll sponsor that.
Well, we're not,
Or well, let's,
all we're doing is we're gonna ratify this next week. We just want to have something for administration to bring forward. Okay, so then one more time, as per Kaylin and Kyle's discussion with us, for a placeholder, we can do 1.84% residential, 3.22 non-residential with a 3% franchise fee increase. Is there anybody against that idea? Okay, so against is Councillor Beekman and Councillor Avery. So it's going to move forward based on that. And then when our council meeting on the 12th, is that the 12th, the next council meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, and then you'll bring that back formally to get ratified then.
Yes.
Okay, moving on. So just so that we get this correct here, moving out of this. So for a motion moving forward, how do you want to word that? Like, council direct administration to bring back a,
I would say some type of balanced budget based on a tax increase, or just balanced budget. I'll defer to Caitlin on the specific wording.
you want to put those numbers in there then too?
I think at this juncture, it would be helpful to have that for clarity. So
Yeah.
something as simple as, for example, I would recommend council make 2 different resolutions, one for operating and one for capital. On the operating side, it could be as simple as the council direct administration to bring back a draft revised operating budget, 2023 to 2025, to council for ratification at the regular council meeting of December 12th, 2022, with the proposed tax split ratio of a 1.75 to 1% ratio, equivalent to a 1.84% increase in the residential mill rate and a 3.22% increase in the non-residential mill rate, along with a 3% increase in the electrical and gas franchise fees.
Franchise fees. So, Councillor Pickering, are you, or Deputy Mayor Pickering, you're willing to sponsor that one?
Yes.
All those in favor? Opposed? Opposed is Councillor Beekman and Avery. And then the second motion, that council direct administration to bring back a draft revised capital budget 2023 to 2027 to council for ratification at the regular council meeting of December 12th, 2022. Any Councillor response to that one? Any further discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Avery, Councillor Beekman. Motion's carried. Okay, moving on to under bylaws and policies, agenda item 7.1, the utility rate bylaw 860-C-12-22, first reading. Our CFO and Deputy CEO Kyle Beauchamp is presenting on that as well. Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay, so the 2023 utility rate bylaw. So this largely stems back to previous discussions we've had with council on budgetary matters. So utility rates, again, are solely used to fund utility projects. So a couple of the big items that we've discussed before with council is the Malloy 2B stormwater project and future funding for water rights, and as well as the future water reservoir. So with those capital projects coming into the future, the utility rate bylaw, we've looked at amending rates to fund these capital projects. So it's not funds going towards the operating budget, it's going specifically towards these projects. I'll talk about specific changes in the bylaw. So section 3, variable water consumption has increased. We're proposing to increase, again, there's no proposed, to $1.2 per cubic meter, up from $1.09 from 2024. Bulk water increased to 3.84 per cubic meter, up from 3.66 in the past year. Section 5 on solid waste, there's no changes to the rates here. This is more so changes for wording, so the bylaw better represents how current practices. Section 6, stormwater increase recommended to go from $7.95 up to $9.95. And section 8, the water meter fee. This is what we looked at. So the 3/4 inch water meter, so anything under 1 inch, those are the meters that you have in your house. Those are put in for construction. Those ones that are being touched or looked at to increase. When we looked at the water meters for anything over 1 inch, so 1.5 and 2 inches, the actual cost that we're paying for those water meters is much higher than what the fee was currently being charged.
So that's non-residential.
Yes. So we would be looking to increase those closer to the actual cost of the meter. Section 9, slight increase in connect-disconnect fees and hourly labor rates to reflect the increasing wage cost. So again, this stems back to the previous discussions with council on November 22nd and November 30th. That being said, I'll turn it back to you, Mayor, for any discussions on this.
Okay, thank you. I'll open up to council. Or any questions for Kyle on any of these points? Deputy Mayor Pickering.
I'm curious on section 6 why it's going from $9.95 from $7.95.
Section 6, yeah, so that is the storm.
That's a storm.
Right? Yeah, so that would be, when we're looking at the Malloy 2B project, right? So that was budgeted a couple years ago for 3.1. That's the project, again, we're doing that stormwater master plan thing. But ultimately for that Malloy project, we're expecting construction to jump from anywhere from $6 to $9 million. So that is a large increase in the budget, and to fulfill that project and to fund that project as a utility project, we have to come from utility rates. And this additional $2 a month would go towards funding increased capital costs related to that project. So it's solely related to the Malloy 2B project.
Thank you. Any further questions? Kalen, you had a comment?
Just a high-level comment about the stormwater reserve that we have. Once phase 2B of the Malloy Drain project on the south side of Coaldale is complete, that's not the only phase within the Malloy Drain master plan. There's also what you can call phase 3 on the north side of Coaldale, the widening of the cheese factory drain and the associated canal system north of Coaldale that leads to Stafford. That greatly would increase our ability to push stormwater on the north side of Coaldale of Coaldale. So we're not looking at this as a fund that we collect for capital for just Molloy Phase 2B. There are other phases even after that over the next 10 years, for instance.
Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor. Section 5, you worded it as that there are no additional increases. It's more just about additional pickups for garbage, recycling, and such. Those are the only.
So yeah, these additional pickups and the additional fees, I believe this was an item that we discussed with council in the council term, and this is how, based on those discussions, these additional fees for if somebody wants additional bin to be picked up, this is how we're currently operating. So this change is to reflect current practice.
Thank you.
Any further questions, comments? So our motion options are that council approve first reading of utility rate bylaw 860-C-12-22 as presented, or that council direct administration to make further changes or request more information. Could I get someone to sponsor one of those two resolutions, please?
First reading.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman made a motion that council approve first reading of utility rate bylaw 860-C-12-22 as presented. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Beekman, Councillor Avery, and Deputy Mayor Pickering are opposed. Motion is passed. And that brings us to the conclusion of our meeting. I need a motion that council move to adjourn at 6:12 p.m. Who cares to do that? Councillor Beekman, all those in favor? Carried unanimously.